You're listening to the 5 Minute Friday podcast episode of The Aligned Self. This is your host, Daniel J-Novi. Okay, 5 Minute Friday, a short and concise podcast episode of The Aligned Self, designed to leave you with a question, an idea, a strategy, a tip, a hack, in order to give you greater access to your conscious awareness, evolving your conscious awareness, or give you greater mastery over your mind. Hello, friend. In this episode, I'm going to introduce you to the concept of a pattern interrupt. You see, every habit, every behavior that we have, there's a syntax of thought, images, auditory information, things we say to ourselves, and sensations that lead us to a behavior, that lead us to a result. And if it's working for you, then by all means keep it. But if it's not working for you at all anymore, or you consider it a bad habit, you may want to interrupt the pattern. And we're thinking of it as a behavioral pattern. Again, a series of thoughts, a series of mental activity, a series of mental events that lead to a result that you no longer want. So every pattern of behavior that's been relegated to the other than conscious mind, or you can consider it an automatic behavior or a habit that you don't even think about anymore, it just sort of happens on its own. There is always a beginning, a middle, and an end. There is a cue that occurs somewhere in your environment. It could be a thought, it could be an external stimulus, but that tells you when to begin your habit, when to begin the pattern. So where we want to interrupt this pattern is just before the cue, or just after the cue, or when the cue happens. See, if we wait too long, the automatic process moves in and you're full force into the habit. And now, if you think back to some of the habits that you've wanted to change and you think you can change them consciously, once you begin it, you're actually aware that you're in it and you're doing something you don't want to do, but you just can't help yourself. It's like the horses are running away with a wagon and all you can do is ride it out. So again, the best place to interrupt the pattern is just before you get the cue, right when you get the cue or immediately after. For instance, when I've worked with people in the past on stop smoking, I have them think about them picking up a cigarette. And there's a moment in time where they are consciously aware that they're about to smoke. So I have them in their mind's eye look down and see the hand coming up to their mouth with the cigarette. And they hear the word stop. And I have them put it down. And then I'll run through that pattern and interrupt it a half a dozen times. And then I'll have them pick up a real cigarette. And at that moment where they look down, hear the word stop, and then they put it back down. Now, if you're a non-smoker and this does not apply to you, you can use the same principle with your smartphone. If you pick up your smartphone one time too many times during the day, see yourself in your mind's eye, reaching for it, picking it up, sort of absent-mindedly, and then realizing you're about to turn it on, and then say stop, put it down. You just checked it 2 minutes ago. And you rehearse it half a dozen times until it feels like it's shifted. And then physically pick up the phone and say, stop, put it down. You don't need to look at this right now. Then it becomes an event that you choose rather than one that is automatic. And then you can reinforce putting it down with an attaboy, pat yourself on the back. Good job. You should be proud of yourself for the exercise of control that you just exhibited. Some of you have probably heard of the behavioral conditioning of putting a rubber band around your wrist, and every time you have a negative thought, to snap it, and then put it on the opposite wrist. And then the next time you have a negative thought or an unproductive, whatever you're trying to shift, and you snap it again. So you get a little pain every time you associate. It interrupts that pattern of thought until you get to the point where you're just about to have the thought, and then you stop yourself without the snap. If you're familiar with EFT or tapping, that is a pattern interrupt where you're having a thought or a belief, you're restating a belief, and you're tapping at different points on your body, interrupting the natural process of exercising that thought. Some of you have probably encountered natural pattern interrupts. Perhaps you were sitting in a restaurant or at a bar talking to a friend or to a loved one, and something happens. Someone drops some dishes, or someone has to get up and go to the bathroom. And then you come back to the conversation, and you're like, what were we talking about? You can't even remember what you were talking about, and it seemed like so important. And sometimes you sit there for 5-6 minutes or more, and you can't remember what you were talking about. When I was a manager, many times I would walk out of my office into the main service area, and suddenly I lost my train of thought, and I could not remember why I had walked out of my office or what I was doing. And I would literally have to go back in my office and reassociate to what I was thinking at that moment, and then walk out, remembering what I wanted to go out in the outer office for. So my walking out into a new environment was a pattern interrupted my thought, because 9 times out of 10, I walk out into that outer office, someone said something to me. You have probably at one point or another heard the phrase, neurons that fire together, wired together. Well, that was coined by Donald Hebb, neuropsychologist Donald Hebb, back in the late 40s. And it described how pathways are created in the brain and reinforced through repetition. So every time you practice a behavior, you kind of wire it into place. And a pattern interrupts the beginning of that pattern so it cannot fire the same way. Think of an old vinyl record or a CD or a DVD. If it gets scratched up enough, it will never play the same, because it interrupts the pattern. It interrupts the flow of information being read by the optical scanner. So what are some things that you can do to implement a pattern interrupt? You can clap your hands and yell, yeah! You can beat yourself on the chest, do a spin, dance a little jig, interrupt something you were about to say by going, eh. Exactly what you do doesn't really matter, as long as it is out of context for the behavior or the pattern that you're typically running. For instance, if you want to interrupt the pattern of reaching for a cookie, you wouldn't interrupt the pattern by reaching for a cup of milk first. It's too much ingrained in the context of having that cookie. But if you were to reach for that cookie and go, I'm not doing it, put it down, that might work a little better. Be as dramatic, as outlandish, as off the wall as possible. And there you have the nuts and bolts of a pattern interrupt, doing anything that you can think of, anything that is off the wall, off the charts, that is outside the context of the behavior that you want to interrupt. And do it at the beginning, or just before, or just after the beginning, so it doesn't have time to escalate into a full-on pattern. Do it enough times, and you will never repeat that pattern the same way. So this has been your 5-Minute Friday with Daniel D'Neuville and the Aligned Self. And until next time, follow your bliss and live the epic life.